Hello and welcome to LA Currents. I'm Saida Pagan. Los Angeles is a complex, fascinating place to live and work in. There are so many stories to be told about its past, about its present, and what its future might be like. And one of the best storytellers in town is Dana Johnson, an associate professor of English at the University of Southern California and the author of several books that are set in Los Angeles. Dana, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Dana, you were born in Los Angeles, but that does not necessarily explain why so many of your short stories are set in this city. Examples would be Elsewhere, California, or In the Not Quite Dark. Why do you choose Los Angeles as a setting for these stories?
Well, there's several reasons. I'm born and raised here. This is my home. And I really wanted to tell the kind of stories that I felt were missing in books that I was reading when I was growing up, books that sort of gave a broader view of California in general and Los Angeles specifically, the suburbs of Los Angeles. And so I just really wanted to tell those stories. I think Los Angeles is mysterious to a lot of people who don't live here and can sometimes be mysterious to its own residents because we often tend to stay in our own neighborhoods. And I've lived all over. I lived on 80th in Vermont when I was a kid. We moved to West Covina. I lived in Echo Park. My family lives in Moreno Valley and Chino. I now live downtown. And everywhere that I've lived and everywhere that I've been in Los Angeles and California is just very specifically its own place. And so I'm just endlessly fascinated. I have endless material because of that, because LA it's hard to pin down. It's a place that's hard to pin down. And I'm not trying to pin it down. I'm just trying to show all of what it is. And of course, that's an impossible task, but I think that's what I try to do in my writing, is just to show the different kinds of Los Angeles that there are.
And it's worth reading. You know, a review of your 2012 book, Elsewhere, California, describes it as, and I will quote, essential reading for Angelenos, Californians, and anyone interested in masterly, morally engaging storytelling. So my first question is, what makes your work and your books essential reading for Angelenos?
I think it has to do with what I just answered, which is that I would hope, and that's high praise, and I'm earning that praise, but I would just hope to, reveal something about place that perhaps readers hadn't seen before, hadn't considered before. And again, I wish that when I was growing up that there were books that, about a little girl growing up in West Covina. I didn't have that. It was all like Hollywood or sort of like, detective stuff. And all that was great, but I never really saw my experience in the literature of Los Angeles. And so that's what I'm hoping that my books do for readers. That's my intent.
And you say your experiences as a woman of color, are those some of the issues or some of the topics that you didn't see explored so much so when you were a child?
Right, that, and also a kind of Californianness about the African American identity, young African American female identity. I never really saw that in books, short stories, and I feel like because I've grown up here in all the various neighborhoods that I mentioned, it's an interesting identity that is multifaceted. And so, again, I'm just really interested in all the layers, all the complications, all the nuances. And so that's what I'm trying to access in my own work.
Well, I'd like to talk now about some of the social issues that you bring up in your work. You talk about things such as income inequality, race, gentrification, homelessness, and it seems as though you're not seeking only to entertain, but also to perhaps inform and maybe bring about social change. Now, I know that you were, as an undergraduate, a print journalism undergraduate. This background, do you bring it to your work?
I think so. One of the things I learned as a print journalism major way back when was documentation. And so that combined with my interest in politics in general, I'm always thinking about in my fiction sort of why I'm writing and what's important to be paying attention to and what I'm drawn to just as a sort of human being wandering the world. And for me as a writer, I want to be writing, if I'm writing, I want to be writing about something. And having lived downtown since 2005, in the Not Quite Dark, the short story collection, I was suddenly living downtown and I was seeing all kinds of, income disparity, the homelessness problem, so many things that I thought, again, not that I was going to be telling the quote unquote truth about, but that there was something about living in that moment and that time and seeing what I was seeing that was important to document. So I guess in some ways that's sort of like my journalism background coming into the fiction, definitely.
Let's talk about you and your journey as a writer. What made you decide to become a writer?
I think like most writers, I loved to read so much when I was a kid. I was a voracious reader. That's all I did. And at some point, there are people who love reading in books, and then there are people who love reading in books and want to try and do the thing that they're encountering when they engage with a book. And so that was me. I really wanted to see if I could do it. And so I first started writing poems, and then I started trying to write short stories, and that's sort of how I started writing. And then seriously writing, I took classes at UCLA Extension. From there, I went to graduate school at Indiana University. And so that was my journey, more or less, just kind of how I was naturally drawn to writing and then how I tried to realize it as a career. I never knew anyone who was a writer growing up. I never ran into writers. So getting the MFA was the way that I, as someone from California with no background in the arts or fiction or anything like that, having access to getting a degree in creative writing, that was the thing that really made me a writer. It's like reading books that I hadn't read before, reading the works of fellow writers, the amazing faculty. I became a serious writer through that process.
And you've won some awards over the years, correct? I heard you, or have heard, that the Flannery O'Connor Award was kind of a breakthrough for you. It helped you professionally and creatively. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, that's part of the thing of the access. It's really more about the access because once I won the Flannery O'Connor, I was sort of on the radar. And from that, I got an agent and all of that. And so the award, it was a huge thing, life-changing for me, because out of that award came my first short story collection. So it was a huge, huge thing in my life to have won that.
And let's talk about your writing technique. And I read somewhere that you actually write in longhand.
I do.
How does that help you with your creative process?
It's so funny because sometimes if you say you write in longhand, it's sort of like people give you the eye roll, like, because it sounds so precious, like, oh, you're writing longhand, how fancy, but or pretentious. But for me, there is an editing process that works for me when I'm writing longhand, because there's the moment from brain to hand to page, but I'm also editing as I'm writing down those initial sentences. I'm editing at that point. And then once I'm typing in my work, I'm editing it again as I type it. And so it's just a natural way for me to, in some ways, sneak in extra drafts, even though they're technically first drafts. It's a way for me to sort of process what I'm writing and thinking about it as I go along. So writing longhand is really helpful. That said, I mostly write longhand. Sometimes there are certain deadlines where I have to just get on that computer and just do it that way. But I prefer longhand. I write on legal pads.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, you know, we were talking about earlier about the challenges that we all face here in Los Angeles, and I'm wondering about how you do your research. How much of it is actually your own personal experience and how much of it is observation of what happens to other individuals?
It's always a combination of the two. For example, Elsewhere, California is about, it's a dual narrative about a young girl who moves from 80th in Vermont to West Covina, which is what I did when I was around 9 or 10. But it's not autobiography, it's fiction. What I was most interested in was what that move meant for assimilation, what that move meant for understanding place in California, Los Angeles, the suburbs of Los Angeles. And so, yeah, I lost my train of thought. But
well, your research, how you you're researching.
So I didn't have to really research that. But there are other stories, say, for example, in the short story collection, the last story in the collection is a story called The Story of Biddy Mason, who was, she erected the first AME church here in Los Angeles, entrepreneur, nurse, and I had never heard of her growing up. And so when I discovered her story, I wanted to write about it, but that required a ton of research. That was something that I really needed to research. So sometimes stories require that kind of research, and sometimes I'm really after sort of the emotional truth of perhaps something that actually happened, which then, though, has to be fictionalized. So I'm not ever writing what happened exactly. I'm always really trying to just write about sort of like what is the story or what is happening here that has nothing necessarily to do with the facts of like, this really happened to me in 5th grade or what have you. It's more about trying to sort of craft a story that is having a particular discussion about something.
The
that
topic.
that I mean to talk about. Sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes the story gets away from you. But that's the intent. That's the goal anyway.
Right.
So a combination of research and combination of just sort of living life.
Mm-hmm. Now, we were talking earlier about the fact that you are a professor, and in addition to preparing your students with the art of storytelling and character development, how much of the issues of social responsibility do you bring to your classes?
I don't think you can force a kind of point of view on a young writer or a writer who's just starting to write. They have to come to their material on their own. But what I do say to them is that they really have to think about why they're writing, why we're doing this, what's important to them, what kind of stories they feel need to be told. Stories like, as I was a kid reading books, I felt like I wasn't in those books, or there are particular stories that they feel aren't out there in the world, and are they the people to do it? Just really thinking about what's important and why write. But again, some students are like, I really don't feel like, I just want to write escapism, or and that's for them to make that decision, what they want to write. But I do ask them to figure out why they're doing it.
So important. Speaking of the why, as you go along as a creative person and as an educator, what are some of the things that you've discovered that you did not expect to find when you began this career?
I didn't realize the kind of emotional intelligence, actually, it requires to teach, because you're not just sort of creating a syllabus, walking into a classroom and talking at people. You're encountering very particular individual humans and you're encountering them on their own terms. And so what I realized on all these years of teaching is that it is really and truly oftentimes teaching it's a collaboration. And I don't think I knew that early in my teaching career. I just thought, oh, you know, you teach, you read some stuff and you teach them, but it's more a sort of collaboration, a give and take, trying to understand who's in your classroom, who are the students in front of you. So that, I think, was a revelation, and I try to explain that to people too, who think, oh, you just walk in and you walk out and this is how teaching goes, and no, it's much more.
Dana, do you believe that there's anything very unique about being a creative person, a writer, here in Los Angeles?
I do find that the landscape really calls to me. There's something about Los Angeles weather, something about the light, something about driving and being surrounded by mountains. All of that, I found myself when I was in grad school in Indiana, writing about Los Angeles in ways that I hadn't before because I was suddenly away. And so I was understanding what I really appreciated about the place that I had sort of taken for granted while I was writing here at home. And so once I had that revelation, always some kind of way, something about the physical Los Angeles, the weather of it, the landscape of it. If I'm writing about Los Angeles or something set in Los Angeles or California, it's always going to have some of that in the work.
100 years from now, when someone reads your books, what do you hope that they will come away with?
I hope that they read my books and think, wow, I thought I knew Los Angeles and I didn't know it as well as I thought I did.
You know, since the publication of your first books, the landscape in many ways has changed in Los Angeles. So how has that impacted your work? And then what's next for you?
So yes, it's 2019 and I moved downtown in 2005, and that was my last book that I'd written in the Not Quite Dark, the short story collection. Stories that are mostly set downtown. And since that book was published and since living downtown all those years, it's changed completely. Many things that I write about aren't even there anymore, just very different place. And so, you know, I'm still always going to be writing about Los Angeles, likely in some capacity, but the project that I'm working on now is a novel, and it's set in both Los Angeles and the American South. And so it's sort of an examination of the United States and sort of the pre-Trump era is what I'm exploring in the book.
And when do you expect that to be published?
I do not know. It is tough going so far, but I'm chipping away.
Well, it sounds fascinating
Thank
and
you.
well worth reading.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for giving us a closer look at your creative process and how you do your work. Thank you so much. Dana Johnson, award-winning writer, USC professor, and a very proud Angelino.
Yes.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of LA Currents. I'm Saida Pagan.